The sun leaned low over the plains, bleeding red across the horizon like a wound that wouldn't close. The west wind carried dust and the smell of creosote, and the whistle of the late train echoed across the open stretch of prairie. The town of Dry Creek wasn't much to look at. One main street, 2 saloons, a church leaning sideways like it had given up hope, and a scattering of shops that struggled against the wind as much as the people inside did against their lives. Jed McCall sat astride his bay gelding near the station platform, hat brim pulled low against the sun. He was a man in his 40s, weather-worn, with shoulders stooped from years of ranch work and eyes the color of gunmetal, hard-tired, always watchful. His ranch, the Broken Spur, lay 15 miles east, stretched thin across dry pastures where the grass gave up too early and the cattle too often fell sick. The ranch was failing. Everyone in Dry Creek knew it. Jed needed help, but more than that, he needed someone who wouldn't quit after one hard week of work. The train hissed as it slowed, brakes shrieking like some wounded animal. Steam rolled out, blurring the figures stepping onto the platform. Drummers with sample cases, prospectors with mud on their boots, a preacher with his Bible tucked under his arm, all bound for Dry Creek or points farther west. Jed wasn't here for any of them. He was waiting to see if his ad in the Denver paper had caught anyone desperate enough to ride this far for work. That was when he saw her. She stepped down last, carrying only a carpet bag and wrapped in a plain gray dress that looked like it had been washed too many times in hard water. Her bonnet shaded most of her face, but Jed could see she wasn't young, not a girl fresh out of school anyway, but neither was she old. Maybe late 20s, early 30s. Her shoulders were square, her hands roughened from work, and when her eyes met his they held steady, not shy, not proud, just steady. Jed climbed down from his horse, boots thudding on the platform. "You the one answering the ad?" he asked. His voice was gravel from years of dust and smoke. The woman nodded. "I don't talk much, mister." She paused, then added, almost awkwardly, "But I can cook." Jed studied her. He'd expected someone desperate enough to talk their way into the job, to spin tales about knowing cattle or tending house. Instead, he got a woman who said hardly more than 10 words. And yet, something about the way she said it, simple, certain, no fuss, made him pause. He scratched at his jaw. "Clara," she said. No last name offered. Jed waited a beat, then gave a curt nod. "Well, Clara, you're hired." The road to Broken Spur, the ride to the ranch, was long, the prairie rolling flat and wide under the dying sun. Jed rode up front, Clara behind in the wagon he'd brought. She sat straight-backed, hands folded on her carpet bag, her eyes fixed on the horizon like she'd been staring at far places her whole life. Jed wasn't much for chatter either. He liked silence. It stretched easier than words. But he couldn't help wondering about this woman who showed up with nothing but a bag and a promise she could cook. "You ever worked on a ranch?" he finally asked. "No," she said. "You know cattle?" "No." "Housework?" "Yes." "Cooking for more, just yourself?" "Yes." Her answers were clean, sharp, like she'd trimmed them down to only what mattered. Jed grunted and fell quiet again. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what he needed. Someone who did the work and didn't gum the air with nonsense. The land grew lonelier the farther east they went. Dry washes cut across the dirt, mesquite and sage the only green left in summer's heat. By the time they crested the rise and the ranch came into view, twilight had swallowed the plains. The Broken Spur Ranch sprawled tired and lean across the land. The big house stood with its paint blistered and porch sagging, corals half mended, fences bowed. A handful of cattle moved slow across the far pasture, ribs showing through hide. The place looked worn like its owner, still standing but only just. Clara climbed down from the wagon without complaint, setting her bag on the porch. She glanced once at the house, then at the barns, then back at Jed. "I'll need flour, beans, coffee, lard," she said. "And meat." Jed's mouth twitched. "I got plenty of beef. It's the one thing this place ain't short on. Then I can work." She said it simply, then opened the door and stepped inside like she already belonged. The supper that first night, Jed expected a thin stew or maybe biscuits that turned to rocks. Instead, the kitchen filled with the smell of frying beef, onions browning in lard, beans slow cooked with a hint of spice. When Clara finally set the plates down, the food looked plain but tasted like home, better than home. Jed ate in silence, but every bite reminded him how long it had been since a meal had filled more than his stomach. Clara ate little, her eyes low, movements neat. When supper was done, she washed the plates without a word and set them to dry. Jed leaned back in his chair, hat tipped low, studying her. "You cook like a woman raised in a house with more mouths than food." Clara paused, hands still in the water. "Maybe? You married?" She shook her head. "No. Kin. None." That was all she gave him. Jed didn't press. Out here everyone had shadows, and most of the time, it was best not to shine a light on them too quick. Trouble in Dry Creek the next morning. Jed hitched the wagon and headed into town with Clara's list. He left her at the ranch to tend the house, though a part of him worried if he'd come back and find her gone. But when he returned, Clara was on the porch, apron dusted with flour, bread cooling on the sill. She looked up, gave him a small nod, then went back inside. That night the ranch hands, 3 men left from what had once been 10, sat down at the table. Big Tom, a robin cowpuncher with a busted nose, shoveled beans into his mouth like a starved wolf. Slim Parker, the youngest, grinned wide after the first bite. Old Deke, grizzled and near toothless, muttered, "Lord Almighty, this is better'n anything Jed's ever fed us." Jed said nothing, but he watched Clara. She didn't preen under the praise, didn't even smile. She just ate quiet, eyes lowered. It was Slim who leaned across the table and whispered low, "She ain't married, is she?" Jed's eyes cut to him sharp enough to kill the grin. Slim shut his mouth and went back to eating. Word spread fast in Dry Creek. Within a week, folks were talking about Jed McCall's new housekeeper, the quiet woman who cooked like heaven and spoke like a ghost. Some said she was running from a man, others from the law. One drunk in the saloon swore she was a widow of an outlaw shot down in Arizona. Jed ignored the gossip, but he couldn't ignore the trouble brewing around town. The Baxter gang, a pack of rustlers led by Clay Baxter, had been circling the county like buzzards. Cattle went missing, fences cut, riders shot at from the bluffs, and above it all loomed Elias Turner, the richest rancher in the territory, a man who wanted Broken Spur for himself. He'd offered Jed a pittance for the land more than once. Each time Jed refused. One evening, Sheriff Holt rode out to warn him. "Baxter's boy's been seen close to your spread," Holt said, chewing his mustache like it was tobacco. "And Turner's likely paying to make your life miserable. You ought to think hard 'bout sellin' Jed." Jed spat in the dirt. "I ain't sellin'. Not to Turner. Not to anybody." The sheriff sighed. "Then you best keep your guns close. Storm's comin'." The shadows of the past that night, Jed found Clara sitting on the porch, hands folded in her lap, eyes on the stars. The air smelled of mesquite smoke and bread. "You hear the sheriff," Jed said, leaning on the rail. "Could be trouble soon." Clara didn't look at him. "There's always trouble, mister. You afraid?" "No." Her voice was flat, but something in it made Jed wonder. She wasn't fearless, nobody was. But maybe she'd known fear so long it had worn down to nothing. He studied her a long time before asking, "You runnin' from something?" "Clara," she turned then, eyes meeting his. In the starlight they looked dark, deep, endless. "Aren't we all?" And with that she rose, slipped inside, and closed the door. Jed stood there a long while, listening to the coyotes cry across the plain. For the first time in years the ranch didn't feel so empty. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the stirrings of something dangerous. Hope. But hope was a dangerous thing in the West. Because hope always drew trouble. Cliffhanger, the trouble came 3 nights later. Jed woke to the sound of hooves thundering in the dark. By the time he grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, the night was alive with gunfire. A lantern burst against the barn, flames licking high. Cattle bawled in terror as shadows on horseback cut across the yard. "The Baxter gang, Jed!" Slim shouted from the bunkhouse, firing his revolver. Bullets sparked against the water trough. Jed dropped to one knee, leveled his rifle, and dropped one rider clean from the saddle. The others wheeled, hollering, guns spitting fire. Behind him the door creaked. Clara stood there, face pale in the glow of the burning barn, her eyes not afraid but cold hard, as if she'd seen this before. And then Jed saw something he hadn't expected. Clara wasn't trembling. She wasn't screaming. She was holding a revolver, and she looked like she knew exactly how to use it. The barn roared like a furnace, flames climbing fast, painting the night in hell's own colors. Smoke rolled thick, choking the air. Horses screamed inside their stalls, thrashing against wood as fire chewed through the beams. Jed's rifle cracked, one outlaw dropping in the dirt, but there were more, 6, maybe 7, circling the yard like wolves. Slim shouted from the bunkhouse, revolver popping wild in the dark. Old Deke staggered out in his long johns, clutching a shotgun, beard smoking where a stray spark had landed. But it was Clara who made Jed's blood run cold. She stepped down from the porch slow, revolver steady in her grip, her face lit orange by the flames, and when she fired, it wasn't wild or green. It was clean. One shot, one rider thrown from the saddle, chest torn open. She pivoted, calm as Sunday prayer, and fired again. Another outlaw cried out, clutching his arm. Jed spared a second to stare. This quiet woman, who claimed she didn't talk much and only wanted to cook, she handled a pistol like she'd been born with it in her hand. Inside, "Clara," Jed barked, chambering another round. "Get down before you're killed." But Clara didn't move. She just ejected her spent shell, slid another cartridge in smooth as silk, and shot a man off his horse. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. The fight raged brutal. Bullets split wood, cattle stampeded through broken fences. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks. When it was over, 4 outlaws lay dead, 2 fled bleeding into the night, and the last rode hard, shouting curses as he disappeared over the ridge. The ranch was saved, but half the barn was gone, a dozen cattle scattered into the dark, and Jed's heart hammered in his chest with more questions than he'd ever had. He turned to Clara, smoke curled around her bonnet, revolver still warm in her hand. "You best start talking," Jed said, his voice low, dangerous. "'Cause women don't shoot like that. Not unless they've lived a whole other life before this one." Clara looked at him a long moment. Then she slipped the revolver into her apron pocket, turned, and walked inside the house without a word. The past that won't die. They buried the bodies at dawn in shallow graves beyond the cottonwoods. Slim muttered prayers, Deke spat on the dirt, and Jed kept his eyes on the horizon waiting for more riders. Clara brought coffee, her face pale but steady, then went back inside. By noon, Sheriff Holt arrived, riding slow, eyes sharp. He studied the burned barn, the graves, the tired men. Baxter's work, no doubt. Holt said, squinting at the smoke still rising. "But I heard tell one of your hands dropped near 3 men with a pistol. That true?" Jed glanced at Clara through the kitchen window. She was kneading dough, sleeves rolled to her elbows, calm as ever. Jed grunted. "That's true." The sheriff raised a brow. "That woman's no ordinary cook, Jed. You'd best be careful. Folks with pasts got a way of bringing their ghosts right to your door." When Holt left, Jed stepped into the kitchen. Clara looked up, flour dusting her hands, eyes unreadable. "You gonna tell me?" he asked. Her hands paused only a second before working the dough again. "Tell you what? Who you are? Where you come from? And why in hell you shoot straighter than any man I've ever seen?" For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara's voice shook, not with fear, but with something heavier. "Regret. I was married once," she said softly, "to a man named Jesse Harper." Jed frowned. "Name don't ring." "It wouldn't," she said. "He wasn't known here, but in New Mexico territory, he was called Black Jesse, outlaw, gunslinger. The kind mothers prayed their sons wouldn't grow into." The room went still. Jed felt the weight of it settle over him like dust. "I learned to shoot because I had to," Clara continued. "Not to rob or kill for money, but to stay alive by his side. You don't travel with a man like Jesse Harper without learning the ways of violence. I cooked for him, I mended him. And when he finally got himself shot dead in a saloon brawl, I buried him myself." She pressed the dough harder, knuckles white. "I walked away. I swore I'd never pick up a gun again. But last night," her eyes lifted, dark and tired. "Last night reminded me the West doesn't care about vows." Jed studied her. He wanted to feel anger, maybe betrayal, but what he felt most was something heavier, understanding. Everyone had ghosts. Clara's just happened to carry a gun. Turner makes his move 2 weeks later. Elias Turner rode up to Broken Spur with 6 hired men. Turner was a big man dressed in fine boots and a white hat he didn't deserve. His smile was oil, his words honey, but his eyes were colder than a snake's. "Jed," he called from his horse, "I heard tell you had some trouble with the Baxters. Sorry for your loss." His gaze slid over the burned barn, then to Clara standing on the porch. His smile widened. "But I see you've found yourself compensation." Jed stiffened. "State your business, Turner." Turner leaned on his saddle horn. "Business is simple. Sell me this land. It's dying in your hands, Jed, but in mine it could prosper. I'll give you cash enough to live easy the rest of your days." Jed spat in the dust. "Ain't for sale." Turner's men shifted in their saddles, hands brushing gun butts. Turner chuckled low. "You're a stubborn man. But stubborn men in the West, they don't live long." His eyes flicked once more to Clara, lingering like a hand where it didn't belong. "And stubborn men's womenfolk. They don't live easy neither." The Jed's rifle came up fast, barrel leveled at Turner's chest. The ranch hands bristled, Slim drawing his revolver, Deke cursing under his breath. For a breathless second it was war. But Turner just smiled wider, tipped his hat, and pulled his horse around. "Think on it, Jed. I'll be back. And next time, I won't come to talk." As he rode away, Clara's hand brushed the revolver in her apron. Jed noticed. She didn't draw, but she wanted to. The long night that night, Jed couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, shotgun across his knees, watching the horizon for riders. The cicadas droned, coyotes called, and inside Clara moved quiet through the house. She stepped out after midnight, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one by him and sat without asking. For a while they drank in silence. Finally Clara spoke. "You should have sold him the land." Jed's jaw tightened. "This ranch is all I got. My father built it. My mother's buried here. I ain't giving it to a vulture like Turner." Clara's gaze was steady. "Then you'll die for it, maybe," Jed said. "But better a clean death than a rotten life." For the first time since he'd known her, Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You're a fool, Jed McCall." He chuckled low. "Reckon I am." The night stretched quiet. For the first time Jed felt the edge between them soften, not gone but bending. High noon. It happened 3 days later. Turner rode into Dry Creek at noon with 12 men and a writ of claim from a judge he'd bought. He announced that Broken Spur was his by law and that Jed McCall was a trespasser. Word spread fast. By the time Jed rode into town with Slim Deke and Clara in the wagon, half the town had gathered in the street. The sheriff stood on the boardwalk, face tight, knowing he couldn't stop blood once it started. Turner stood tall, hands on his silver belt buckle, grinning wide. "Well," he drawled, "you come to hand me the deed or you come to die." Jed stepped off his horse, rifle in hand. "I come to tell you this ranch ain't yours, and it never will be." The street went silent. The clock over the mercantile ticked. A dog barked once, then went quiet. Turner's hand hovered near his pistol. "Then let's settle it like men." The crowd parted, dust swirling hot under the sun. Jed squared his shoulders, rifle lowered to his side. Turner's hand twitched, gun clearing leather, and Clara stepped forward. Her revolver barked once, clean and sharp. Turner's hat flew off, a bullet hole dead center between his eyes. He dropped like a sack of grain, his men frozen in shock. Clara's voice rang cold and steady. "The West don't need another vulture." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the sheriff barked, "That's done. Stand down." Turner's men wavered, then fled, leaving their boss bleeding in the dust. The town cheered, but Jed didn't cheer. He turned to Clara, who stood calm, revolver still smoking. "You broke your vow again," he said softly. Clara's eyes were dark. "Some vows ain't worth keepin'." The road ahead, by sundown, Dry Creek buzzed with the tale. How Clara, the quiet woman with no past, had gunned down Elias Turner at high noon. Some called her a heroine, others whispered outlaw. Back at Broken Spur, the ranch hands fixed fences, drove cattle home, patched the barn. The place felt alive again, though danger still lurked on every horizon. Jed sat on the porch, watching Clara set bread to rise inside. He thought about her words, about vows, about ghosts that never stayed buried. When she stepped out, wiping flour from her hands, Jed met her eyes. "You still say you don't talk much," she said. "But seems to me, when you do, it's worth listening to." Clara looked at him, and for the first time her smile wasn't faint. It was real. "Then I'll stay," she said. "For as long as you'll have me?" Jed tipped his hat low, heart heavier than lead but lighter than it had been in years. The West was a hard place, cruel and unforgiving, but for the first time Jed McCall felt he wasn't facing it alone. And sometimes that was enough.